So hi everyone. Um, Welcome to our panel on the differences between erotica and porn, because that's a fun topic for everyone. To start with a little bit of a joke, what does a werewolf think when faced with a sex test? Not hard. Okay. So, I am Thurston Howell. I'm not streaming from a church, Greg. My name is Thurston Howell. I am an editor for Sinister Stoke Press, as well as Thurston Howell Publications. And
Hi, I'm Izzy, otherwise known as Weasel. I'm a queer Latinx author, a domestic violence survivor, and the owner and the dude of Weasel Press and Sinister Stoke Press.
yeah, so we're going to be talking about some fun discussions and debates today. It's going to be fun. Just as a anticipated note, we are going to be talking about some 18 plus materials, so try not to be under 18 for this. We're generally just going to organize this as a discussion, a Q&A. We have some notes up on our screen, so it's going to look like, even though we're talking to each other, we're just looking at the screen. That's because we kind of already have our bullet points up on our screen here. So, how about you? Begin.
So, to start it off, this might be a big question, but what's the differences between erotica and porn?
Okay, it is a big question. So, I want to start by saying, like, there are multiple debates about this. A lot of the old debates kind of had two major concepts in mind. The first is that some people think there's a difference between porn and erotica, and some people also lump smut in there as a third category that's somehow completely different. And the other aspect of this debate is usually that what distinguishes these two or three categories is there's sex and there's plot, and these two are at odds with each other in the story itself. So there was recently a book that just came out of essays on publishing and editing called From Paw to Print. And there were a few really cool essays in there about porn and erotica and the differences. Now, there was one by Voice, and Voice in his essay kind of talked about, he had these three hard categories: porn, erotica, and smut. And he kind of defined how each one is very sectioned off. And that was kind of a big part of it, even the organization of that essay. To contrast it, pretty much right after his essay in the book was one by another editor, Katav, who kind of talked about the theory behind sex positivity and the way that affects these allegedly different genres. So there's definitely this idea of sex positivity that matters whenever we're looking at what's erotica, what's porn, what's something else. But I'm going to argue in this panel, at least, that if there even is a difference, it's a lot more semantic than a lot of furry writers probably think. So that's kind of going to be my argument. So how would you define the difference if you see one?
I mean, for me, I think, much like in Katav's essay, I think the terminology is a little problematic. Erotica stems from like a more classier or marketable phrase, and porn just kind of tosses it out almost like it's trash. So yeah. I'm more on the side of to do away with both terms, say something like sex-focused or something along those lines that is not as defining.
Yep. Sex literature.
Yep.
Sure.
So, you're talking a lot about sex positivity. Can you go over what that exactly means?
Yeah. So the just the AIDS Action Council defined sex positivity as the foundation of sex positivity is simply the idea that all healthy and explicitly consensual sex is a positive element in life. And they go on to say what that could mean in different spheres of life: political, personal, professional, stuff like that. But the general idea here is that healthy and consensual sex can be a positive thing. It's normal. Having sex and being engaged in kink doesn't make you lesser in any way in any sphere of your life. Do you have anything you'd add to that?
Not really. I think it's a statement I fairly agree with. But I do have to ask, aren't furry writers sex positive anyways, given the amount of erotica they already write?
Not necessarily. So, first of all, let's think of this concept of sex positivity as two separate things. First, a label that one applies to oneself, and secondly, a performed code of conduct. So the former we see all the time. I've seen people, even some furry editors and publishers, say out in the open, yes, I am sex positive. And then at the exact same time, those same people have messaged even me privately and said, you posted nudes online and therefore you're not professional. You should feel ashamed for engaging in this behavior. So being sex positive is more than just a label you give yourself. You have to actually enact that as a practiced politic. Have you ever encountered anything like that on your end?
Yeah, a little bit. First thing I want to discuss is the term professionalism, mostly because it's a problematic word. Professionalism is essentially synonymous to white supremacy. It comes from properness. If you look at it historically, it's colonization. White people are teaching the quote unquote savages to be proper. And it's morphed into what we call today professionalism.
Yeah.
And what that means is keeping marginalized voices out of places like the workplace, out of the publishing industry, and out of spaces where, BIPOC, queer, trans people, disabled people, we're all necessary and valid in these spaces. So if anyone's saying that you're unprofessional, I would look at them in a different light. I would look at them in a different light and I would question their business.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when I first started Red Ferret Press, I was told that all I was a smut peddler. That's all I was doing. So I have had that before. I do have an adult account where I do post nudes, and I'm getting an OnlyFans account. And stuff like that shouldn't be seen as negative or in a bad light. It should, it's just as normal as everything else.
Yeah.
So, but moving forward, let me ask this: So what would that look like in terms of like writing or publishing for erotica?
So any argument that says that narrative sex or sex stories, whatever, has this sharp contrast, this imagined dichotomy between sex and plot, inherently claims that sex needs some deeper character interaction to matter or be a valid or worthy story. So separating sex from plot is this really weird pseudoscientific idea that comes up a lot in the furry writing community. For a lot of writers, they naturally merge together. For an editor to come in, read your story through this lens of a practiced sex negativity, and decide your story is 33% plot and 66% sex, and tell you need to up the story is inherently problematic. And of course, this is something I've actually seen. I was once given the literal percentages for plot and sex on a story for an anthology I submitted to a few years ago. Is that something you've ever seen?
It's not something that I've experienced personally, and the reason I say that is because I don't necessarily submit to a lot of fandom publications, mostly because those publications are run by people who aren't people of color, people who aren't marginalized, and a lot of times that viewpoint makes people from marginalized communities feel unsafe. And as a Latinx author, I can definitely say I've not felt safe submitting to fandom-led publications. So, and that's something I'll talk more about tomorrow in the diversity panel.
Cool.
But to ask this question, what makes that a problem, really?
So I guess what makes furry that kind of philosophy a problem. Well, you get a lot of beginning furry writers who have parroted, even to me personally as an editor, that they've heard this sex versus plot debate. And they show me their story for a beta read, and I find myself saying, this whole interaction between the sexual partners is very divided. Their romantic plot feels like one story, and their sexual encounter reads like a totally different one. I don't know why the character's knowledge of Renaissance painting, which bonds them in romance, is important for understanding how quickly one can bring the other to sexual climax. Like, I don't see that, you know. In the beginning, Furry Writer, of course, tells me that someone said they had to have these outside romance scenes for it to be considered good furry writing. And it makes it clunkier, not better. It's okay for sex to stand by itself. So, I mean, coming into the furry writing community years ago, I was told all these things about sex and story myself as a beginning writer. Were you as well?
There's definitely a debate that's happened for several years. Even when I was first coming into the fandom, it's definitely something that I've seen in furry writing chats. I've seen it on discourses on Twitter. It's a familiar feeling. So what you're talking a lot about sex versus story. Can you speak more as to why you find that problematic?
Yeah, so I have two major spiels here. First, splitting those two up assumes that sex itself isn't a narrative, that it needs plot imposed over it to even be a story. Let me tell you, when I write a sex story, I could start by putting the couple or moresome together. I give them foreplay, they have sex, they climax, they revel in the afterglow. And what I just described is more or less Freytag's pyramid. Exposition, rising action, climax literally, falling action, resolution. Sex naturally follows the most basic of narrative rules. Obviously, I wouldn't suggest following that formula exactly for Erotica and do that for every story. Hell, I wouldn't even suggest using Freytag's pyramid for your non-sexual stories. But my point is that sex doesn't need a whole backstory on the characters or a bunch of useless filler to be a good story. Now, my second point is going to go against what a lot of naysayers would complain about the first point. I imagine some people would hear that first point and think, well, you need to have the characters interacting in the sex, talking, emotionally bonding, stuff like that. Doesn't context matter? Well, here's my pushback there. Being sex positive means that being open to multiple kinds of it means being open to multiple kinds of sexual expression and multiple sexual norms. If you have sex always leading to romance or always based on it, you're just subscribing to heteronormative sexual values, even if your characters are queer. For me, I'm in an open relationship with you, and you're my fiance. And on top of that, I'm very active in hookup culture. For me, I go on hookups at sex clubs where the lights are dim and you don't know anyone's names. I go to people's houses and knock on their door wearing a blindfold, and I never even see them. For me, sex can be multiple things. It can be romantic. It can be just fun. It can be stress relief sometimes. And each of these are valid. It's hurt a lot when I hear people, even in our writing community, who tell me that stories of sexual expression, except for romantic ones, are, quote, just smut. It's why I write a lot of erotic horror myself, because I find hookup culture to be full of all kinds of just creative opportunities for that kind of stuff. And I know you're kind of exploring that too. I love seeing what you did with your book Carnage, because you explore sex clubs, grinder, and bars, even in a furry setting. So you're kind of challenging the sex versus story aspect too, right?
Yeah, in a way. A lot of what I do is writing horror through through this lens. But a lot of it is throwing my own personal experiences and fear and just life moments of like domestic violence and things that have happened to me. I throw all of that into the story. But yeah, it's something that I'm definitely working on in regards to like challenging that narrative. So when you say you want to see more porn in furry erotica, what exactly do you mean by that?
Oh, I would love to see so many more stories based on hookup culture. So many more. I fucking loved the book Learning to Go. I think it was by Mike Donnelly, I think. I think so. I loved that book. It had a sex worker in it. And it was such a good, really positive portrayal. I liked the book All Tied Up in Knots for similar reasons. I didn't care for the super positive portrayal of the wealthy in that story, and but it had this interesting relationship with sex positivity too. It had a character actively hooking up, so it was representation. Period. We got hookup culture in that novella, but it also worked to shame group sex and had this overarching message that people in hookup culture need to find someone who will love them and save them from their own sexual expression. Like that was the end goal of the story. Um, so it's like that's the kind of thing I like tackled more. I'd like to see furries who actually, at least furry characters, who actually engage in hookup culture in these stories. I'd like to see more open relationships, more poly sex, more sex with people with HIV, more sex workers. I'd love to see more furry stories that are okay saying the sex itself can be a story. It doesn't need a whole backstory for the characters. I don't need to know what family drama they're having or how many breakups they've had or their coming out story. I mean, we still need more coming out stories, of course, but in terms of my erotica, I'd like to see more than just that. It's like perfectly interesting stories could be a wolf's first time in a sex club, a lion dealing with anxiety over trying out a new kink, a weasel trying to go on a hookup with a fox he knows has a reputation for being slutty, but he doesn't care. Stuff like that. We don't need to know how passionate these characters are about rugby or how they've been looking for 30 years for their one true love and here's their chance. I'd like to see a story where sex is understood to be the story, not something separate, disparate, and just a means to an end. That just doesn't interest me that much. Do you have anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, it irritates me whenever I see romance prioritized over sexual expression. It's a very heteronormative mindset that I wish we'd break. One of the first books that I read coming into the fandom, and it's always been one of my favorites, is Circles. Circles is a great book, but one of the things that I hate is the character, I believe his name is Ken, gets slut shamed so many times in that book to the point where it breaks him down. And it's like you feel so bad for this character because the whole household is seeing him differently. He's on a lower level because he's having hookups with other men. And it's tragic if you think about it. So I would like to challenge that and say, hey, why don't we have more erotica that challenges heteronormative culture? Why don't we have that in our fandom? One of the things that I loved about doing Omer was someone submitted a personal essay and it talked about their first time at an orgy. And I loved it. It's like there was no connection with other people. It was just exploring themselves. It was exploring themselves in a safe space. And it was just about having fun and breaking your own fears. Now, why couldn't that translate into fiction? Because that would make some good fiction.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I guess to your point, I mean, it all makes sense. At this point, does anyone out there in the audience have any questions for us?
Yes, there's been a lot of really cool stuff on the chat here. Tanfer is asking if I'm Aro. I am not. It's just I am tired of seeing just romance in furry erotica. I'm not really against romance. It's more that I hate that sex has to be tied to romance in the fiction.
Again, it's a very heteronormative mindset.
Yeah. K-Loss says, I feel that even with the fandom in mind, the very anti-sex versus pro-sex nature of a lot of society has a habit of polarizing reactions in the moment. It's one thing in more personal or open spaces, but throw it on the street, if it isn't fulsome or similar, you're going to get a polarized reaction one way or another.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
yeah. You're going to get different reactions, especially polarized ones.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my personal experience, I did a poetry reading where I talked about eating out my partner's ass, and that was
Yep.
that was detrimental. Even though they asked for it, like they even said, "Hey, read this poem." I told them what it was about. They said, "Read the poem," and I did, and I was still kicked out of the party.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're gonna get different reactions no matter what.
Yeah. I'm cycling back through the chat now and seeing some of the other messages. Let's see here. So it was said early on, I've always felt that erotica is more about character and story, and porn is more about gratification for the reader. But they're not distinct categories. One can be both. Sure, and it's, I guess part of the issue is that if you even think in terms of those, even if you call them loose categories, then you go into the system of saying, this story has certain value, this story has other value, especially given the cultural stereotypes behind each word, because that's different regardless of your own personal distinctions, really. Agreeing with what we were saying for parts there. A lot of people talking about the smut peddling. People agreeing on the professional aspect, yeah. Aiden says, I have a novel that's 100% about plot and the sex is inherent to it, as the protagonist is bisexual and his feelings are about, let's skip down for a second, are about, that are who he is. So like plot, who the character is and how he develops is plot. Yeah, it's important to really think about the ways that sex can be story as you're kind of gesturing to. Drizix says, having solid rules about story building, be it a story heavy on sex or not, is a foolish thing. After all, it is not a computer we're building, it is art. Yeah, flexibility is important. Can't agree with that more, for sure. I'm catching up finally. I love Summer Otter's commission title, Who Needs Plot? Yep. And for talking about personal agency, people can do what they please. Yeah, and it's one of those things that it's like, it sounds like that's a really easy thing to say. You know, that sounds really, really easy to say. But it's like there's so many people, even in our own editing and publishing experience, who say, no, this form of expression isn't valid. We're not going to publish this because it's not story focused enough, whatever that even means. Rikoshi's essay on that is good, yeah. We talked about that. Aiden says, sex versus romance. I love, 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 love romance, but it's not necessary. Sometimes you just have fun. Absolutely. I want to see more fun sex stories besides just going to So Furry. I'd like to see anthologies that actually embrace that. Ocean adds, how are romance narratives heteronormative? I don't think that's really what we're saying here.
It's not that we're saying all romance narratives are heteronormative. Queer characters can definitely have romance in their lives, but I think we're fed a heteronormative image from getting together with one single person to getting a family to having children. All of those things are at the very beginning fairly heteronormative that we adapt as queer people in our lives. That being said, it's something that I would like to still see challenged moving forward.
Yep, exactly. I agree. Somewhere out adds, so damn the plot, full porn ahead. Yes, please. I want to see more. Kalos adds, to me, porn with no plot is just a plot that is hyper-focused on the porn going on. People like that because for a reason they want some sexual energy. But that also means you could make sport plot that you could just call sport that's hyper-focused on the game. So now instead of describing a game going on or reading the porn equivalent of sport. I can see it. That makes sense. I don't disagree with that. Old Pine says, it would be nice to see stories where sex is as mundane, no commonplace. Perhaps as grabbing a coffee or going to the gym. A joy to seek for its own value rather than requiring primary values to justify the sex. Absolutely. Hands down, paws down, yes. Drizix adds, in stories that are not at all focused on sex, I do try to encourage some good attitudes. I mentioned in my current work in progress that there's a big hookup culture in a particular space, and everyone's okay with it, even if some of those who participate are otherwise monogamous in other spaces, and no one judges anyone negatively about being of any lean or behavior there. Good. That's all good. We need that. Aiden adds, bringing up publishing is a big thing. I feel like it can be hard, I see that, to sell something with sex in it. Something with sex in it, which is silly. People like sex. Yeah, it's one of those really weird things. I think in a previous commenter mentioned is there's this weird dichotomy of anti-sex and pro-sex, even with a single person. Because someone will say, yes, we love sex, we love publishing erotica. But when it comes to they're like, well, what's this character's backstory? What sport do they like? What's their favorite board game? And if you can't answer that question, they're like, oh, this isn't really what we're looking for then. So it's this really weird thing because, yes, sex sells, especially as Ocean says, yes, sex does sell. But what gets the publisher interested in it is rarely over the sex. For a lot of the main publishers, it's more of who are the characters, what makes them unique as characters, etc., etc. So it's weird because even though the sex is a major selling point, that's not what really sells it to the publishers or the editors very often. Summer Otter says, most of my stories generally focus on the point I'm writing it for. Heck, sometimes I don't even name the characters. Yeah, and that especially works with flash and short fiction, as you're saying, too. Drizix adds, humorously, favorite sport, team sex, favorite board game, sex chess. I love it. I want a story that's just called sex chess. We need this. Ocean adds, what would you two say separates a bad sex story from a good one? That's a good question.
I think lack of sensory details.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely lack of sensory details. So definitely for Furry. One of the things that I loved about your anthology that you did, called Sensory Details, was that it challenged authors to focus on a single sense, sight, smell, touch. Without these senses, you just kind of lose the whole story. I had a story that was submitted to Omer that was really sexual, and if it just had just more sensory details in it, if it had just what the characters smelled like or even what they looked like, it would have been a good story and it would have gotten accepted.
Yeah.
So definitely sensory details.
For sure. And I mean, just because I see Summer Otter's comment here, saying the difference between good and bad sex stories is in the hand of the fapper. It's like, it's true. It's like, what makes a good sex story is one that's fun for the reader. It's like, I don't know about you, babe, but like when I'm watching Pornhub, I usually skip to the actual porn bits. I don't need to hear about how this is someone's role-played stepfather or how they're going through a drive-through first, etc., etc. It's like I really don't. I skip past all that. I don't want people to have to do that in a story, if that makes sense. For erotica, it should be arousing. That's the general point. Again, romance stories are fine too, but I think it's fine to have a story that focuses on sex from the beginning, from the first page, and foreground that. And if it's an arousing story, it's a good one.
Yeah.
And I can usually tell if the author has fun with it too. If they're using a bunch of clinical language, a bunch of cold language, a lot of passive voice, very blasé topics, it's not going to be as interesting. Looking at comments here. Kayla says shorter tends to work better for the FAP unless you're an avid reader, then the words are worth a certain number of strokes. Pun intended, perhaps, or unintended. Yeah, flash fiction for erotic is definitely fun. Oh, that's just a Nightbot. I keep thinking it says Night Eyes because I know he's in the chat too. So I'm like, that's Night Eyes, right? And it's like, no, it's just Nightbot. Fuzz says, but I really want to hear what kind of pizza the boy is delivering or what kind of home repairs that plumber's there to fix. You can't watch porn for the story. It doesn't work that way. Alva Wolf says, I do consider asexuality, chat scrolled, to be valid, but how would I write a story with characters that are ace, aro, demi, etc.? Oh, that's so much fun. I've seen stories that kind of do that exact thing. Because there are other forms of intimacy for a lot of asexual people, between cuddling to hand holding to just watching a movie together to sleeping in the same space, all clothes on or no clothes on. It's like you can have so much fun writing an erotic story, even for ace, aro, demi people. Absolutely. And it's always good to have
sensitivity readers.
Thank you. I was about to say sensory readers. I'm like, that is not the right word.
Nope. But yeah, it is definitely good to have sensitivity readers backing up your work.
Right. Let's see. Yeah, I get you, Night Eyes. Kayla says, yes, you can if it gets you off. There's a kink for everything, or a kink for kinks. Some writer says, but said story has 4 really hot scenes so far. I haven't gotten past the first. That might be a good sign then, if you're still winking your way through the first one. Resolute Right says, I mean, how did the plumber come to be a plumber? What was the defining moment to put them on the path that would incidentally have them knuckles deep in neighbor's plumbing? Oh, no, it hurts. And it's like, people in this chat are making fun of this, but it's like, I have seen these stories from fairly big name, not super big name, but fairly big name furry writers. It's like, this is a common thing. This isn't something that's just relegated to the worst 10 stories of So Furry or anything.
These are in anthologies.
Yeah, they're in anthologies. And I'm like, where's the skip button in the story so I can just go to the porn? And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. And as Drizik says, there are some folks who are kinky even though they're mad about actual sex.
Yep.
I think my computer froze.
How long is our panel? We have 20 more minutes? Or are we done?
20 more minutes.
Okay.
Let me try to pull this up on here and see if that helps at all.
Am I doing another one with you tonight?
Oh, it says it's working. It's just my screen is frozen. So I'm still waiting for the computer screen to boot back up because mine is frozen. The last message I saw was Drizik saying there are some kinky ace people they know who are mad about actual sex. I see in the chat, I'm looking at my phone now. Been a few times I've tried to write something lewd and suddenly realized I was 20 pages into a technical manual. It was time to abandon ship and try again. Yeah, it can be tough to navigate that. Absolutely. It's tough to get out of that clinical, not just clinical words, but sometimes the clinical setup and organization. Ocean adds, many people feel the opposite. They don't want the skip button to the porn. They want everything up to the porn, the anticipation, the emotions, the character's motives. I feel there is a divide. Some people just want the sex scene to get off. Others want the story. And I'd say that's totally valid. That's fine. I think part of our issue and motivation with this panel is that, yes, both ideas are valid, except right now only one is being heavily prioritized by the furry publishing industry.
It's about inclusivity.
Right. So it's not that we want to get rid of one entirely. It's that we need to open up the market a little more. The next message is Domus Vocus says, The Lusty Adventures of Theseus is a book I've read where the main character Theseus is an 18-year-old virgin going through the motions of his first myth. But there's literally 1 to 2 gay sex scenes every single chapter, half of the time connected to the plot. Yeah, it's That's it's interesting when we can have things that are like that and that be okay. Crimson says, I mean, we do have room for both. We need to have room for both, I would say. I'd say there are a lot of anthologies open probably right now even that aren't that open for both.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too familiar with what the current furry anthology market looks like right now.
Yeah, I know a lot isn't open right now.
Yeah, I know I can say for Weasel Press, we have a erotic anthology that is all about sex. It's about sex and magic. And for that, I'm more so looking for what we're talking about here in this panel.
Yeah.
I'm not like an anthology.
Sure, it would look pleasant. I feel like that would look. I don't think it's something that necessarily needs to like exist as a separate genre so much as something for editors to consider. Period. When reading stories for excellent anthologies, or do you think there should be separate anthologies?
No, I mean it doesn't necessarily have to be separate.
Yeah.
I hate the idea that we have to separate these things.
Yeah.
I think, again, there should be a more inclusive space. And what we're saying is the space currently is not that inclusive.
Yeah.
And you can say that about a lot of things in the fandom.
Yeah,
I can go off on some tangents.
I know you can.
And I will be doing that tomorrow.
Yeah, you will with
diversity panel.
Yep. Drizix adds, perhaps we should get to tagging stories with build-up versus no build-up to recognize that both are acceptable and for folks to be able to pick the ones they want to experience. I could see it. I don't think that's a bad idea. Ocean pretty much agrees we can have more porn anthologies for sure. Yeah, okay. I agree. Summer Otter says, on the converse side, I love, where'd it go? I love Kyle Gould's writing, but I hate his porn stories. I'm also a fan of Kyle Gould's writing. I have probably 2/3 of his books. But no author is infallible. None of us are.
I'm very indifferent to Gould's writing.
Yeah. Doma says, my main problem with pure smut is when the story just says the character is a muscular dog and that's it. Now,
what he said?
My main problem with pure smut is when the story just says the character is a muscular dog and that's it.
And that's where those sensory details comes in, though.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's not really relevant to whether it has story or not. That's just how it's written. Because just because it's pure smut doesn't mean we want it to be badly written. That's not the argument.
Again, so like we said earlier, the story needs to have some kind of sensory details. It needs to be able to pull you in to what's happening right there at that moment. Mm-hmm. I see what they're saying about the writer only saying this is a muscular dog. Well, that's where the editor comes in and says, let's push that further and let's describe that more. What does the dog actually look like? What's the color scheme of the dog? What does the dog smell like? Right. So on and so forth.
Yeah, agreed. Summer Otter says, I try my best to keep looping back to the species and reinforcing the mental camera of my reader that the character is a skunk or a wolf, etc. Yeah, that's good. That's important to do. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's whenever you're writing any type of furry fiction, it's always important to go back to the character that you're writing, because even when I write furry fiction, I often forget who my characters are halfway through. Yep. So it's important to like keep notes or something. Yep. Because it happens.
Yeah, that's a frequent comment I leave on your stories.
What's the next question?
Tanfer says, why not both types? Some open and on either side for others. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're advocating for is that kind of openness.
Inclusivity.
Yep. Doma says, do you prefer smut stories with only a bare minimum of plot? Again, it's not really that we're preferencing it to where we want that to only be the market. We're trying to advocate for a more inclusive market. Kind of as Ocean had said, have more porn anthologies. Have editors that are more aware of those distinctions or perhaps lack of, and being more open to different kinds of sexual expression. I don't think we're advocating for one type of story over all others. Kayla says, if the challenge is opening up to more porn media works to publish, it's actually on our screen now. I think part of the issue is the profit margin. It was for some competing with social acceptance. You tell someone you're selling a book about saving a country from blowing up and it has sex. They will say there's a story in there, so we have to accept it. You tell them it's a compilation of various random sex scenes. They will ask you, apart from being porn, what are you selling me here? Unless you are a company that doesn't care and emphasizes porn to begin with. They do it. People they expect to get it, won't care what they sell, and they just grin at the scandalized. I mean, I hear you. I think Izzy and I are so invested in a kind of sex positivity activism, though. So it's like, we're like, screw the scandalized. They'll get over it eventually, centuries from now.
Yeah. One thing I could say about Red Ferret Press is that we'd like to publish more sex-focused novels. Those novels that you would find at what you would call like a porn store or something. Like those are the kind of novels we would like to see more of at Red Ferret Press. Yeah. Whether that's a profit margin or not, that's a whole other panel. What I can say is like some of the books that we sell, we only get $2 back on. So profit margin isn't necessarily a high concern for us, but we want something different. We want something sex focused, and we want something that contains marginalized voices. That's the kind of publisher that we are. Yeah.
Iggy says, I love pure smut. It's what got me started writing, and I think there can never be enough. Hells yeah. Doma says, I'm talking about when a story doesn't explore much of the characters. They're just a blank character going through the motions without any sign of personality. Again, I don't think that makes it a certain genre of erotic. I think that's just bad writing.
Yeah.
You can say things deeper than dom or sub. Yeah, Bog says that can be done while asking me how. Yeah, so that doesn't really have to do with the type of, whether it's erotica or porn or smut. Those categories don't matter on that front. Crimson says, depending on how long the story sticks around, that might be enough characterization. Yeah, if it's flash fiction, I mean, I think Summer Otter could probably talk to that more than I could even, just because they do a lot more flash fiction than I do. But yeah. Crimson says, or maybe depending on how much you try to hang on their characterization. Doesn't need to be a load-bearing character, yeah. Again, we don't necessarily need to hear their whole backstory to have a good story.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I like to see is stuff that's in the moment, not stuff that contains the entire world.
Right. And someone asks if we have a website.
Well, that's yeah.
I know mine. What's yours? Weaselpress.com?
Yeah, just weaselpress.com.
Yeah. Okay. So there's our two websites. Fuzzwolf says, well, the bottom should be a load-bearing character. I get it. Summer Otter says, you can give a lot of personality in a small amount of words, especially how they do actions that you're going to have them do anyhow. Hells yeah. Agreed.
So time for more questions.
We do. We've been flying through.
Yeah, we flew through this panel.
Yeah, I was like, that whole talk is going to be like 40 minutes and we're not going to have any time for questions. Little did we know. And this is why I tell my students, make sure you practice your presentations before you do it so you know the time. Let's see. Summer says, sorry, I'm also organizing my comics. Duroc says, I'm so here for more of Fuzzwolf's puns. Yeah. Fuzzwolf wants to know, what flavor is your vape?
So this is a crunch berry. So Captain Crunch, basically. It's my favorite. And it took me a while to find it here in Michigan. I had to get it special made when I was in Texas.
Yep.
So, crunch berries.
Doma says, remember gay pulp fiction that focused on porn? I mean, we could have a renaissance of that.
Yeah. I know just a month ago I picked up a bunch of novels from Taboo Up the Road. So
Resolute says, always here for more puns. Douglas adds, puns are love, puns are life. Iggy said, God, there's porn flash fiction I read on FA years ago as a closeted teen that still sticks with me years after it's long lost. I really can't say enough about the necessity of good smut. Yeah, I actually have a similar story. Fuzz knows this story. The first furry short story I ever read, because I was doing a research project on furries in college, was a short story by Taron on a website of his or something, and I think it was called "Fun in the Mall," which was this dubcon story about a internally homophobic wolf who bites off more than he can chew and ends up like handcuffed to a gay cruising spot in a mall somewhere. So it's like, yeah, I get that experience, Iggy, for sure. And it was a completely, there was not much quote unquote plot there, but I loved that story because it was a real sex story. I didn't need to know what the wolf did before he was at the mall. Let's see. Drizzik says, I love experiencing panels like this as it gets me pondering about ideas, plot, story focuses I wouldn't have thought about before. Awesome. We love that. Send us all your stories. We will publish them. Night Eye says, I feel the same on a few things that are only on archive.org now. Yep. I can believe it. I mean, granted, you say archive.org like I would remember what that is. I'm a very young fur, so I don't know what you speak of. Galos actually recalls that story. Dirk Coyote says, the wiki that went with that story is etched in my brain. Fuzz says, that story is still on Taron so far, if anyone's curious. And it's in Seven Deadly Sins, too, I think. That was published in Seven Deadly Sins, I believe. Domus, that's all you read. Sex stories can help us discover our sexuality, sexual preferences while we're trying to figure it out. Yeah, like, you'd be surprised how many times I, like, discovered I was into a kink by reading about it. It's like, yeah. Domus says, by the way, put this on a t-shirt. Go with your gut and read the smut. Yep. Wear that around at next year's Oxfurred. Crimson Wayback Machine. Oh, sorry. Archive.org is the Internet Wayback Machine. In some cases, the only journal record of websites long dead. Makes sense. The back of that shirt should say, I said gut, not my butt. Oh, no. It escalated so quickly. Aiden says, myself, I feel like plot is misunderstood. A character learning something about what they like feels like plot to me. Absolutely. Now, whenever I say sex versus plot, I'm really referring to this very specific thing that I have heard spouted in writing communities, where they actually say you should have more pages before the sex. You should have a deeper, like the relationship between the two sexual characters should mean something besides the sexual moment.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely using a very, very specific definition of plot in this context that is not encompassing of all plot, because realistically any story is plot no matter what. So I'm being very specific when I'm using that word. I probably should have prefaced with that, honestly. Eitherface says, I'd love to have the focus to write more like educational smut, stories that have sex that can lead to better sex. People always denigrate porn as teaching bad lessons as though that's the only way it can be. Yeah, I immediately think of two stories. I think of a story by Fallon called Good Boy, which is all about pup play. And I think of, I can't remember what it was called. It was a story by TJ Mind on a young furry going to a kink, I think it was a bondage seminar, and actually had sexual experience demonstrated in that seminar. So that was really, and like educated you on how to do knots and stuff in the story itself. So that was super cool. Some writer says, "Oh hey, it's going so fast now, which is awesome. Oh hey, I just found a mature furry comic called Short on Plot. Oh, that's lovely. Sense of humor is always nice." Al Song says, "Do you have any tips for improving a sexual scene after a first draft read through during the editing phase?" That's hard to say, just because it really depends on the story and what issues it's having. But I mean, I guess if I had to say something general, I would say um, look at each individual scene and ask yourself what its accomplished or intended emotion is for the reader. Like, do that kind of reverse outline. Look at each individual segment of the story and ask yourself how it functions in the emotional narrative for the reader. That'd be my idea. Do you have anything to add?
No, I'd second that one.
Okay. Resolute says, "Definitely realized I was bi after years of MM furry art stories, chipped away the fragile illusion of my heterosexuality." Yeah, I'm the same way, I guess. Like, reading a lot of gay furry sex, like, was like, oh, I could totally rock being a bottom. It was very inspirational for me. Doma says, "Yes, I love those kind of stories, like how they teach consent or how to have a better sexual experience." Absolutely.
Yep.
Resolute says, "There's a comic series by Feck that has excellent real talk and good advice about sex for a first timer." Awesome. We need lots of those kind of comics. Crimson says, "Yeah, Tiny Sex was basically how I figured out I was bi." Yeah. Jonathan Ver says, "Yes, porn can do so much more than just being arousing. It can deeply ritualize." For sure. Kayla says, "To me, the flow of the story should make sense, whether sex is involved or otherwise. If you're starting with sex, I expect to at least learn enough afterwards to find out why that's where it started. If that's covered, I'm good going forward."
I think it depends on what you're writing.
I think it depends on what you're writing. Because, like, if it's a sex club scene, we don't need to have the character going back home and reflecting on his experiences. I think we don't need the summary of that in reverse. So I think it really, really, really depends on the story.
Yeah.
But I will agree, though, with the general statement of the story should make sense. Absolutely. I don't think we're advocating for a flowless story. As I said earlier on in the talk, like, sex naturally has flow to it. If you just had sex, that's still a story by itself. Yeah, that's fair. Kayla says, "Well, it's a sex club." Basically answers it. You now know the character goes to sex clubs. Yeah, I get you. So yeah, we're not advocating for removal of all story altogether and just having sex positions as a list or anything like that. Aether says, "There's a website where someone stuck sex toys in a jar and they melted. So I recommended steel and glass toys because they don't break down." It's good to know.
And that's something that should be talked about more in for erotica anyways, is the idea of consent and talking about kinks. One of the things I liked about Will of the Alpha was how some of the stories handled consent with some of their BDSM fiction.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. I don't see a lot of... Okay, so at least in published furry fictions, and not so furry, nothing like that. In published furry fiction, I really don't see a lot of kink happening. And when I do, it's often kind of happenstance. It's not something that was talked about a lot beforehand. There wasn't a sex contract happening, or kink contract,
And that's something that I think is really focused on those particular kink anthologies. Again, like Will of the Alpha, it really goes into some of that with some of the stories. But you're right, I don't see it that much outside of outside of kink anthologies.
Yep. Agreed. Drizik says, "Know what your goal for the writing is, and the answers for a lot of things will flow from that." Absolutely. I agree. Jennifer asks, "Are you counting poly as kink?" I'm going to say yes. Okay. I would count groups interest in group sex, threesomes or more sons. That's a kink. Being polyamorous, I would say, is not a kink. That said, I would advocate for both appearing more.
Yeah, I would advocate for both appearing. I feel poly is more of a lifestyle in a way. I'm poly myself. And there are several books on poly that you can pick up that can teach you more about what that's like and what poly romance is versus what poly sex is.
Yeah, because that's the difference.
What I would recommend is you look into things like More Than Two or even the Ethical Slut. Those are the two big ones. I like More Than Two a bit more because it's got a better approach. Ethical Slut is good. It's just a bit too utopian for my taste.
Yeah, that one's pretty straight oriented, isn't it?
Both of the books are fairly straight oriented. I don't find a lot of poly books that are queer focused, unfortunately.
Crimson recommends Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator. You know that one?
I've heard of it, but I've not read it. It's on my to be read pile.
Yeah, we'll check it out for sure. Absolutely. Jennifer says, "Cool. My work in progress novel from your workshop in 2018 is all about polycule. Not by that name. It's 16th century." Yes, I love it. The Elizabethan polycule. I love it. The good years of the French. It's a menage. I love it.
We have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, we have a couple more minutes if anyone has any final questions for us. And as usual, you can I'll just put my @ on here too if anyone wants to have.
Yeah, and put mine on there too.
What is your @
Systematic Weasel, so the normal spelling.
Like that?
Yep, just like that.
Just because I like to make sure people have our contact info if you ever need. The Crimson says there's a set of poly characters in one of the later books in the Expanse series, which is handled pretty well. Yeah, I think I remember hearing about that. Summer Otter says, final question. How much wood could S. Woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck was a gay furry? I don't know much about S. Wood.
You look at me for it.
I don't know. Depends on how much fox DNA that gay furry has, I guess. I think that has a severe influence and impact on the amount of wood it could take.
I think he clarified a woodchuck, not S. Wood.
He knows I'm teasing. At least I hope he does. All right, well, I think we're about out of time. But thank you all so much for sitting in on this talk. We had a blast, almost literally.
Yeah, and definitely hit us up if you have any more questions.
Hells yeah.